The world was not ready for what happened next. Cameras flashed, news anchors stumbled for words, and the financial markets trembled. In a bold move that sent shockwaves across continents, Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fearless leader of Burkina Faso, stepped up to the podium and announced something no one saw coming: the launch of Africa's first sovereign digital coin. The crowd erupted as he declared that Africa would no longer depend on the dollar, on foreign banks, or on Western systems that have kept the continent chained for decades. Within hours, global headlines screamed, "Traoré challenges the West again." Some celebrated him as a visionary. Others called him reckless. But the real storm was yet to come. From Washington, a warning came not from a diplomat, but from Donald Trump himself. In a fiery statement, Trump warned Traoré that such a move could destabilize global markets. Yet Traoré stood firm, unshaken, and confident. His message was simple: Africa must own its future, and that future begins now. This is not just a story about money. It's a story about power, sovereignty, and courage, a moment that could redefine Africa's place in the global economy forever. The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou like molten gold spilling across the earth. The air felt charged, humming with something larger than the dust, larger even than the drums echoing from the crowded square. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones trembling under the same heat that shimmered above the roofs. On that morning, Africa was waiting to breathe again. The crowd wasn't there for another speech. They had heard promises before every election, every crisis, every new plan whispered by men in suits. But today, something felt different. People spoke softly, as if the sky itself was listening. They said a single word again and again, letting it roll off their tongues like a song: AFRICOIN. Inside the presidential compound, the young leader who had become a symbol of defiance stood before a cracked mirror, adjusting his jacket. His aides whispered about foreign reactions, warnings, and the millions of dollars in aid that might vanish. But he wasn't listening to fear. He was listening to history. He remembered his grandmother's voice, how she spoke of the old days, when African gold backed European currencies, when cotton, cocoa, and oil left the continent in ships that never returned their value. She used to say, "Our hands create the world's wealth, but our pockets stay empty." Those words had burned into his memory. Today was the answer. He walked to the balcony, the noise of the crowd rising in a single heartbeat of anticipation. Cameras clicked. Drones hovered. In that moment, he wasn't just a president. He was the face of a movement that stretched from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Lagos to Lusaka. He raised his hand, and silence fell like a wave. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady and deep. "For too long, Africa has built the wealth of others. We trade in their money. We borrow under their rules. We pay interest for our own sweat. But today, we rise." A cheer rippled through the crowd, carried by the wind. "Today," he continued, "we launch AFRICOIN, the first digital currency owned and built by Africans, for Africans. No foreign banks. No colonial interests. No strings." The plaza erupted. Flags waved. Women ululated, their voices piercing the sky. Somewhere, a street vendor dropped his basket of oranges and shouted, "At last!" For a brief moment, hope was visible, tangible, alive. Back in the control rooms of the world's financial capitals, analysts stared at screens, blinking. The markets fluttered like startled birds. Was this just a symbolic act, they asked, or the beginning of a storm? On the other side of the ocean, commentators debated in polished studios. Some smirked, others frowned. But one thing was clear: the announcement could not be ignored. AFRICOIN wasn't just a coin, it was a statement, a rebellion coded in blockchain. Meanwhile, in the heart of Africa, young engineers celebrated quietly in dimly lit labs. They had been working for months under strict secrecy, writing lines of code, connecting servers powered by solar grids, ensuring that every transaction on the AFRICOIN network would remain transparent, incorruptible, and most importantly, sovereign. One of them, a 23-year-old developer from Ghana, whispered, "This is what independence feels like." That night, as bonfires lit up the towns and villages, the young leader sat by his window. The world outside was cheering, but he knew the real battle had just begun. He could already feel the tremor of resistance brewing from abroad, the messages from powerful lobbies, the veiled threats from foreign investors, the sudden freeze of a few international accounts. But beneath the uncertainty, he felt peace. He wrote in his journal, "We have entered the storm, but this time the sails are ours." Night fell over the continent, but sleep would not come easily. News tickers glowed across the world's screens. Africa launches sovereign digital currency. In global financial centers, traders whispered to one another as if the words themselves might trigger an earthquake. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a private jet left Washington, its passengers deep in conversation about what they called the digital rebellion. Within hours, statements began to pour in. A former U.S. president, now a powerful voice in international media, appeared before the cameras. He spoke with his familiar mix of charm and warning. This kind of move could destabilize global markets. Africa needs partnership, not isolation. His tone was calm, but behind the diplomacy, the message was clear: don't step out of line. In Africa, the reaction was the opposite. From Kigali to Kinshasa, from Accra to Addis Ababa, people crowded around radios and phone screens, cheering each new update. Farmers in the Sahel toasted with calabashes of millet beer. Students in Nairobi painted AFRICOIN on dormitory walls. In the markets of Lagos, traders asked one another if they could soon sell goods in the new currency. For the first time in generations, talk about money didn't mean dependence, it meant possibility. The next morning, the leader of Burkina Faso met his small circle of advisors in a sunlit room filled with maps and data screens. The air smelled of fresh coffee and nervous hope. One advisor read aloud a message from a major foreign bank announcing the suspension of aid transfers. Another mentioned that 2 neighboring governments had received offers to abandon AFRICOIN integration in exchange for debt relief. The leader listened quietly. When they finished, he smiled slightly and said, "When they try to buy your silence, it means your voice has power." Then he turned to the engineers present and asked if the test transactions had gone through. They had. Farmers in rural cooperatives had successfully exchanged produce vouchers for AFRICOIN credits using nothing more than solar-powered phones. It was small, almost symbolic, but it worked. Across Africa, that first week became known as the 7 days of testing. People experimented with the currency on local markets. Merchants traded coffee for grain. Musicians sold songs. Programmers offered code. Every successful transaction felt like a drumbeat in the march toward independence. The outside world grew louder. Editorials warned of data vulnerabilities and security risks. The same voices that had once lectured Africa on innovation now dismissed it as reckless. But something had changed. The people no longer flinched when scolded. They had seen that their system functioned without permission. Meanwhile, the former U.S. president continued his warnings. In an interview beamed around the world, he said, "It's dangerous when nations start creating currencies that aren't anchored to the dollar. It threatens stability." Yet, behind the rhetoric, analysts saw fear that Africa was building a door that couldn't be locked from outside. Back in Ouagadougou, the leader visited a community tech hub funded by local cooperatives. The young developers greeted him not with ceremony, but with pride. They showed him dashboards displaying transactions between small farmers and artisans in 5 countries. "We are proving it works," one of them said, "and nobody can delete our database from abroad." The leader nodded. "Then protect it," he replied, "because they will try." That night, under a sky bright with stars, he spoke to the nation. The broadcast went out in 10 languages, translated by volunteers across the continent. "AFRICOIN," he said, "is not just code. It is trust. It is a signal that our resources, our trade, and our dreams belong to us." He paused, looking into the camera. "To those who tell us to stop, we say, you have used our gold, our land, and our people long enough. This time, you cannot use our fear." The reaction was electric. In university halls, students replayed the speech again and again. In rural towns, elders nodded silently. In the diaspora, millions felt something stir, a pride long buried beneath headlines of poverty and conflict. For once, Africa was speaking, and the world was forced to listen. A week later, the first international test came. A major African mining company announced that it would begin paying local contractors exclusively in AFRICOIN. Western shareholders objected. Some withdrew. The stock value dipped, but within days, small investors across Africa bought in using the new currency. The price rebounded. Commentators called it the first market correction powered by the continent itself. At a policy forum in Europe, economists argued about what to do. Some said to ignore it. Others insisted on sanctions. The former U.S. president, now sounding more impatient, declared that Africa was playing with fire. But sanctions were harder than before. Trade routes were shifting south to south, and new partnerships were forming among African, Asian, and Latin American nations willing to test AFRICOIN for small deals. Inside Burkina Faso's central data center, a low hum of servers filled the cool air. On the wall hung a map of Africa, lit with tiny dots, each one representing a verified AFRICOIN node. The network was alive, growing faster than anyone had predicted. The leader watched silently. He thought of his grandmother again, and the generations who had lived and died without owning the fruits of their labor. He whispered to himself, "Now the value stays home." But victory brought new challenges. Cyberattacks began coordinated floods of data aimed at destabilizing the network. For 48 hours, transactions slowed. Rumors spread that AFRICOIN had failed. International pundits called it proof of immaturity, yet African engineers worked day and night, patching systems, rerouting traffic, writing emergency code. When the network came back online stronger than before, the hackers disappeared as quietly as they had arrived. The event became a legend, the digital siege. It reminded everyone that sovereignty was not a ceremony. It was a constant defense. Months passed. Markets adjusted. Western corporations quietly approached African governments, offering to list AFRICOIN on global exchanges. Some leaders hesitated. Others refused outright. The Burkinab leader remained firm. "We will integrate when we are ready, not when we are invited." In the villages, ordinary people began to notice changes. The cooperative that once depended on foreign grants now funded its own tractors. A group of women who made shea butter products formed an online store accepting only AFRICOIN. They called it "Our Hands, Our Wealth." The phrase spread faster than any advertisement. In schools, teachers used new lessons about digital finance and sovereignty. Children drew pictures of satellites carrying African flags. They didn't understand all the economics, but they understood pride. A year after the launch, a summit was held in Addis Ababa. Delegations from dozens of nations arrived, carrying proposals, questions, and sometimes doubts. The hall buzzed with anticipation. When the Burkinab leader took the stage, he didn't speak of triumph but of responsibility. "We have opened a door," he said, "but a door is only useful if people walk through it. AFRICOIN is not perfect, but it is ours. Let us improve it together." He turned toward the young engineers seated in the front row. "You are the guardians of this new independence. Do not sell it for applause or fear." The audience rose in applause. Across the continent, the speech was replayed in classrooms and cafes. Commentators noted how calm he was, how the revolution he had started now moved with the quiet confidence of inevitability. Meanwhile, in Western capitals, analysts began adjusting their language. They spoke less about punishment and more about partnership opportunities. The same media outlets that once ridiculed the project now called it a case study in grassroots fintech success. Publicly, they praised it. Privately, they scrambled to understand how it had slipped beyond their control. The former U.S. president, now semi-retired, gave one last interview on the matter. He sighed and said, "They've done it differently. Maybe it's time we learn from them." It was as close to an admission as the world would get. Back in Burkina Faso, the sun set again over the same square where it all began. Children chased each other between market stalls. On a wall, someone had painted a mural of a coin orbiting Africa, like a planet, rays of light connecting cities and villages. Beneath it, the words read, "Our signal, our future." The leader walked among the crowd unnoticed for a moment. He heard the vendors quoting prices in AFRICOIN, saw the satisfaction in their eyes when they completed a sale. The sound of ordinary life had become the music of independence. He stopped near a group of students, debating the next step. They were talking about renewable energy, digital education, and Pan-African science exchanges. He smiled. They weren't waiting for instructions, they were already planning the next revolution. As night settled, he returned to his office and looked out over the glowing city. Somewhere beyond the horizon, satellites carried the signals of the AFRICOIN network across the continent. Each pulse of light represented a transaction, a connection, a fragment of freedom. He thought again of the words he had written that first night, "We have entered the storm. But this time, the sails are ours." Now the storm had passed, and the sails were still standing. The journey was far from over, but Africa had proven to itself and to the world that the winds of change could blow from the continent outward. In the closing minutes of the documentary, the narrator's voice would soften as images of bustling markets, classrooms, and laboratories filled the screen. They said Africa could not lead. They said its dreams would crumble under pressure. But here, where the sun rises first on the human story, a new chapter has begun. A coin was only the spark. What followed was a rediscovery of worth, a quiet revolution written in code and courage. From the dust of history, a continent lifted its head and claimed its own horizon. The camera would linger on the leader's reflection in the window, then tilt upward toward the night sky stars scattered like digital nodes connecting invisible networks.